Hi, everybody. I'm Craig Eliason. I'm coming to you from St. Paul, Minnesota, where I teach in the art history department at the University of St. Thomas. I'm also a type designer with T-line fonts. And today I want to share with you a talk called Baselines Are Overrated, Reconsidering the Hierarchy of Typographic Constraints. Here's an overview of what we'll be talking about. I want to start with the idea of constraints, which comes to me in context of design from Charles and Ray Eames. In 1969, they were part of an exhibition in Paris, France, which included a back and forth question and answers that became eventually published and a little film made called Design Q&A. And this is where I encountered the idea of the importance of constraints for what design is really about. So Charles, in talking for the couple, was asked, does the creation of design admit constraint? And he said, design depends largely on constraints. What constraints? The sum of all constraints. Here is one of the few effective keys to the design problem. The ability of the designer to recognize as many of the constraints as possible. Their willingness and enthusiasm for working within these constraints. So this idea of constraints as being central to design really has stuck with me. And one of the things I've been thinking about is what do you do when constraints clash, when you have a kind of contradiction in what the design wants to be. And for an example of that within the world of type design, I thought we could look at an example of a monoline face. And my example here is Memphis, designed by Rudolf Wolff in 1929. This was a kind of a serif version of Futura, which is really big at the time. And both Futura and Memphis would be classified as monoline typefaces. That is, instead of having thick and thin lines, big stems, and slight hairlines, all the lines are made to be read pretty much as the same thickness. So the crossbar of an H is about the same thing width as the stems. An O is kind of the same thickness all the way around, and that's true of the medium, of the bold. Now, some of you are looking at this very carefully and saying, well, that's a little skinnier at the top than it is at the side. And it's true, there are subtle modifications of these in part to address optical illusions, which are familiar to people who have been in the world of type design. But I hope you grant that for the most part, these are meant to be read as monoline faces, as faces with the same thickness in every stroke direction. So that's the medium and the bold. What happens when you get to the extra bold, which was drawn for Memphis by Griffith, for C.H. Griffith in the 30s? And we see things change. Well, the capital H is still tries to be monoline. The O, the ultra bold O, extra bold O is still rather kind of circular all the way around with the same width. But look at the E. The E, things change dramatically, right? So the medium E is certainly monoline, faithfully the same all the way around. But the E in the extra bold is obviously not, right? The curve is thickest at the side. That's much thicker than that same curve by the time it gets to the very top of the letter. And that in turn is quite a bit thicker than the crossbar, which is thinner than anything else. So what's going on here is constraints clashing. There's a kind of contradiction, right? The face sort of wants to have all these things true. Weight should be ultra bold, contrast is monoline, counter spaces are in balance, vertical metrics are consistent. By counter spaces in balance, I mean the open white spaces within letters, like in the middle of the O and in the middle of the E, are similar in size, in area. And by vertical metrics are consistent, I mean basically these letters sit on the same baseline, right? With curved letters, we got a little bit overshoot, but even that is consistent. And the top of the letter overshoots the midline of the same amount. So the X height is the same for these two letters. So you can see what the problem is, right? If these are kept monoline, if the top of the E was the same as the top of the O, then suddenly that counter has no space left for it, right? So something's got to give. And as we look at the design, we can see what did give, right? So here we have those four things that Memphis wants to be ultra bold, and yet they can't all be true at the same time, right? There's a contradiction. So what we see in the design, we can sort of reverse engineer what the priorities were among these typographic wish list. And when we see what Griffith did, we can say, okay, vertical metrics seem to be, consistent vertical metrics seem to be the highest priority, right? These letters definitely still sit on the same baseline, have the same midline, have the same X height. Down at the bottom of the list we've made, contrast is monoline, right? It is for the O, but if it doesn't work out for the E, keeping all these other things to be true, then that has to give, right? So that's lower on the priority scale. So there's a hierarchy, in other words, right, of these typographic features. And when we see hierarchies, we want to challenge them, right? So here, once again, is our hierarchy for Memphis. And vertical metrics are consistent was the top thing on the list, right? That trumps everything else in the case of Memphis. So what I started to wonder is, are there typefaces for which that's trumped by something else? And if so, what would that something else be? In other words, can different fonts have different hierarchies? And the answer is certainly true, yes. And my example is Mistral, the breakthrough script font put together by Roger Escafon in 1953. And here's what Mistral looks like. You're probably familiar with it. And I've provided a little red baseline for the font, but you can see that's not really a baseline that this font heeds, right? The letters themselves dip below it, some remain above it, some within the same letter kind of go above and below. So this kind of average baseline doesn't really tell the tale of what this font looks like. And if we redrew the baseline to correspond to where the bottoms of letters are, we'd wind up with this crooked thing. So what's going on here? At first you might think, well, this is just some arbitrary looseness with respect to the baseline, which is intended to make it look like it was written very quickly, like a casual kind of handwriting errors kind of thing. But if you look more carefully at how this font is put together, and particularly take a look at where the connections are between the letters, and I've marked those in lighter red here. And if we fade everything else out, we can see something about these connections. That is, they are all at the exact same height and the exact same angle. So there's nothing arbitrary about these letters going up and down. They go up and down or change scale in order to hit that connection to the next letter at the right height and the right angle, the correct angle. And so the reason why this has to be is because, among other things, Mistral was released as a metal type font, right? This was the middle of the 20th century. And metal fonts are, by their nature, of course, separate letters assigned, glyphs assigned to each metal sort. So to make a connecting script, the height and angle of that connection had to be the same because you're going from one sort to the next. So there was kind of no room for having those connections have to bend themselves to make sure that things stay on the same baseline, right? That has to be the priority value. So we were wondering if anything could be above vertical metrics being consistent, and that's certainly the case in the case of Mistral, the connecting strokes aligning is more important. So what we have here is not only that there are hierarchies of typographic values in given font design, whether they're explicit or most often implicit, but knowing those are hierarchies and that they can differ, that invites the opportunity to challenge them, right? Making hierarchies of constraints explicit not only allows for a clearer understanding of the design solution, it may also open possibilities for challenging those hierarchies. And that's what I want to talk about next. With a kind of experiment, unreleased design I'm working on now, which features what I might call inside-out letters that I want to share with you. So we return to Memphis Extra Bold, our E here that we were looking at before. We have our hierarchy of typographical commitments, vertical metrics at the top, those are unmovable. contrast is monoline at the bottom. That's something that can adjust if the things above it require it to. And so my question is, what would happen if we take this same list, but we reverse it? And we say suddenly contrast is monoline, and this time we want that to trump everything else. And at the bottom, vertical metrics are consistent, but if the things above require it, that can be flexible. And the question is, what would that look like? And here's what I think that would look like. This is my design that is a casual font with letters that, as you can see with this red baseline, don't really pay too much attention to where the baseline is, right? The I, for example, is floating well above it. The T, the O are kind of sitting on it with little overshoot, as you might expect, but then the E, the A, the S, all of those are dipping quite a bit below it. And correspondingly, all the letters at the top are also unaligned with each other. So what's going on here is that these letters are different heights because they are built from the inside out. That is, I'm trying to keep the stroke weights as consistent as possible and the counters as balanced as possible. And what that means is that letters that have more going on, like the E, like the A, like the S, are going to have to be taller. And I've said that's fine because the vertical metrics is lower on my priority list. And so you can see these counters are balanced with each other. They are roughly all the same shape, kind of in the same neighborhood of shape anyway, and size. The E, maybe for the joint, it gets a little shorter, but it's not being compressed like we saw in the ultra bold Memphis. So how do I decide what height to put these letters since they're not hitting the baseline? They're actually very carefully aligned. They're just not aligned on a baseline. They're aligned on a midline, you could say, a middle axis that goes through the center of the X height. And in this case, they are lined up. It's just that each letter has a different height depending on what it needs to be to preserve its counter and its weight. And then they are lined up to center on that axis. So what's the result? We get what I would say is an informal but a less arbitrary typeface. So here's the my design at the top, and I'm comparing it to the most famous. It wound up looking quite a bit like a casual writing font, informal font, and so I brought in the most famous of all these in the digital era anyway, Comic Sans, a bold version of Comic Sans. And you can see that these are in some ways similar in character. They have the kind of casual, easygoing, maybe a little bit childish or friendly. But the way they interact in terms of vertical metrics is really different. I keep looking at this M in Comic Sans, which has this weird sort of the middle stem goes well below the baseline. Why does it do that? Just to make it look like it's a sort of casually, haphazardly, accidentally drawn font. So where Comic Sans does these kind of arbitrary dips below the baseline, all of the reasoning for ignoring the baseline in my font is in service of this greater typographic value of basically what you could say is even color, right? The color of a typeface comes from its stroke weight modulation patterns and the consistency of its counter spaces, right? So the white and black and how they balance each other. And for my font, unlike Comic Sans, I would say, for my font, that sort of white-black balance is kind of the highest priority. As a result, we have a font that, to my mind, is a little easier to read and more comfortable to read. Mine's on the left and Comic Sans again is on the right. Comic Sans, in addition to having a way too large word space, which is really annoying to me as a reader of this Comic Sans sample, but even the words themselves, I'd like to think that my flexibility with the vertical metrics allows for letters that have a kind of better match for each other, and it's a readable version of a kind of informal script. Here's a out of focus version of both samples. And this helps, I think, to show that that kind of evenness of color is something that I was after, and it kind of comes through in the out of focus version. You can kind of see the evenness of color, and I think that helps with the sense of readability when you're looking at it normally. So what conclusion can we draw from this? The inside-out strategy that I've just laid out is not only a way to rethink the informal Latin letter form, it is also, and maybe more importantly, a reminder that a designer who forgoes any design constraint, even one as basic as a baseline, may at the same time open up an opportunity better to satisfy other constraints, like, for example, even typographic color, right? So you can move things up and down that ladder, that hierarchy, but I encourage you to think about this question. When you are demoting a typographic value, what are you promoting? Right? I'm all for challenging any kind of assumptions about what a font should be. But when you're doing that, I think as you're taking something down in terms of how much it dictates what the letter should look like, what kind of opportunities are there for better serving other typographical values. So I hope that was useful and interesting for you. Thanks for your attention, and I'm here to answer questions.